Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show on News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO. Joining us on the phones, the executive editor, co-founder of the Texas Tribune, Ross Ramsey. Ross, good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Chad. How are you?
Doing great. Appreciate you joining us today here on the program. A lot of stuff going on down in Austin. It seems as though, Ross, things are finally starting to heat up. And I don't know if the kumbaya is over, but there are some battle lines that are starting to emerge when it comes to, in particular, education, right?
Yeah, they talked off holding hands, as you know. You know, they did the big thing in front of the governor's mansion, and we were all singing kumbaya. The governor had his golden retriever out there. It was heartwarming. But the House is turning back into the House, and the Senate's turning back into the Senate. And they're coming up with differences on what they said were the three main bills that, you know, they were going to push. Property taxes, school finance, and teacher pay, all at this point look like there are significant differences between the House and the Senate.
And I think publicly you have the leaders who they've sort of disagreed, maybe publicly. Speaker Bonin has been a little bit more, at least publicly, saying, we're going in a different direction on a few things. But when it comes to the differences, I think let's take a look at school finance and teacher pay. In particular, this is where I guess the battle lines are really lining up right now, correct?
Yeah, I think the lieutenant governor surprised the governor and the speaker a little bit with his declaration that they were filing a bill that would give teachers a $5,000 a year pay raise. Up until that point, Abbott in particular, but also Dennis Bonin, had been talking about merit raises for teachers, not doing a statewide across-the-board pay raise, and now they're a little bit at odds with that. There's also some differences. You got to get into the weeds a little bit, but there's some differences in how to fund those teacher pay raises, whether they go through school finance formulas and are under the control of local school districts, or whether they come straight from the state, as the lieutenant governor has proposed.
Right, and when I had the speaker on last week when I was in Austin, the speaker said this, a teacher pay raise for them, and the way he was looking at it, it would be two separate issues. So you would have school financing, and then you would have, paying teachers more. For the House, these are two separate issues, right?
Yeah, they're separate issues. They're all linked. If you stand back and look at this, property taxes, school finance, the state budget, and the teacher pay raise are all interlinked, and you have to talk about them at the same time. But I don't think that the speaker wants all of those things to be in the same debate. I think he wants to, let's take these debated pieces one piece at a time so we can manage ourselves.
We have, 80 days left in the legislative session. It just seems like it started. We've got about 80 days left. It's going to be increasingly more difficult as we move forward, correct?
Well, yeah, this is a giant funnel. They file something on the order of 6,000 bills. In fact, today is the deadline for filing bills. And they pass something between 1,200 and 1,600, depending on the year. And so you get to a point where most things die, and you start killing most of those things by running out of time. They start really slowly every time. It's like a roller coaster with a big hill, except for the big hill's about 7 weeks long. And now we're starting the ride, and everything's busy. The hearings are on. They're going to be killing legislation like crazy, and it's going to get angrier and angrier over there as bills meet their fate. What do
you anticipate the battle looking like? Is this going to be something that we see play out in front of the cameras? When Joe Straus was Speaker of the House, obviously there was a lot of friction, and there was publicly a lot of friction between the lieutenant governor and even the governor and the speaker. Speaker Dennis Bonin. He's very direct. He can get in your face, and he is not shy about telling people what he wants and which direction he wants to go there. Are we going to see this spill out in front of everybody, or is this going to be behind the scenes with these three, having a debate?
I think it'll spill out, and you have to remember that the Capitol was built as a fighting box, right? We decided to make our decisions in there instead of with gunfights out in the parking lot, and so they're in there to debate. I think the difference right now may be that these won't be personal fights. There'll be fights over issues. There'll be fights, or what I anticipate is that the They'll spill some blood, but I think they'll spill it over ideas rather than personalities.
Right.
If they get into personalities like they were into during the Strauss-Patrick Abbott years, then you get a whole different set of problems, and it makes it harder to work on anything.
Visiting with Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Where are we at right now on property tax reform?
I think we're at the point where we start talking about, well, maybe 2.5 is not the number. The Senate committee passed out a bill that said if local property tax revenues go up more than 2.5%, there's an automatic election, and voters get to say whether they want that tax rate or those taxes or not. The sponsor of that, Paul Betancourt, doesn't look like he has the votes on the Senate floor for that, and so they're starting to talk about the numbers. If it's not 2.5, it's like a green eggs and ham operation. If it's not 2.5, would you like it on a boat? Would you eat it with a goat? They start talking about numbers. The House is leaning, some of the conservatives even in the House are leaning more toward around 5%, which would be halfway between where the House and Senate settled last time. I think, if you had to predict the future here, you'd probably say they're going to get a bill. It's probably not going to be at 2.5%.
Yeah. And that's interesting that you brought up 5% because I didn't hear that from anyone last week. And I guess things have even progressed more since then because when I had the lieutenant governor on, he was wiggling a little bit. On that number. He said, well, 2.5, 3, 3.5, 4. So he wiggled a little bit.
We're at an auction here.
Yeah, exactly. And so, 5%, I mean, that's getting close to that 6% number where nobody really seemed happy with in the last session.
Yeah, the House voted out a bill that had 6%. The Senate voted out a bill that had 4%. And they couldn't find 5. It wasn't as simple as numbers, though. If you remember 2 years ago, the Senate was trying to add education savings accounts into its bill. The House was trying to put a bunch of education spending into its bill. And that's actually an illustration of what Bonin's trying not to do this time. Don't get more than one issue stuck in these bills or you're arguing at cross purposes. So if he can keep school finance in box 1, property taxes in box 2, teacher pay raises in box 3, and the budget in box 4, he's got a better chance, he thinks, of getting some legislation out.
Visiting with Ross Ramsey here on the Chad Hasty Show, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. You mentioned it earlier. Today's the final day that lawmakers can file legislation. Any talk about anything major that will be filed today?
We're still waiting for the Senate's school finance bill, which is interesting. This is the day, when a governor declares an emergency issue, it means that you can consider legislation during the first 60 days of the session, which happens to end today. And one of the big emergency issues, the one they all agreed on, was school finance, and the Senate doesn't have a bill out yet. The House waited until Tuesday of this week to file their bill. That's not to say they haven't been working. They've been working their heads off. But we're waiting to see that bill. That's certainly a major piece of legislation. The lieutenant governor also has signaled that he's going to have 20 issues that he's going to call priorities. I assume he's going to do that by blessing bills that have been filed, so it may be that some of his priorities have been filed and some will be filed today. But today's like a giant, today's like a dumpster fire. Everybody's filing everything to beat the deadline, and we have a counter on our internal website that tells us whenever somebody has filed a bill, and for days it wasn't doing anything, and now it's going like a roller coaster.
What does it say to you that the Senate has not filed a school finance bill? Because normally when it's a big piece of legislation, look at property tax reform, there's a big press conference. We announce this thing, and normally everyone in the media is told about a day beforehand, maybe 2 days, hey, we're going to have a big press conference. Everyone needs to be there. Is it a priority if they're filing a bill last minute?
I think it's a priority, and they've said it's a priority. You're right. They don't have the big, attendant rollout. There's no parade, and they're not doing it that way. They were trying to do with the school finance bills what they did with the property tax bills, file identical bills in the House and Senate and go from there, sort of, what everybody down here was calling kumbaya moment. And they couldn't get agreed, and part of it was this teacher pay raise thing that we're talking about. There's some other differences in their bills, and I think there are some differences inside the Senate about how to do this. And this is hard work to do. There are giant differences. There are small differences actually between the parties on this. There are bigger differences between school districts that are on the small end and school districts that are on the big end. districts have all kinds of different problems. There's 1,200 of them in the state, and it's hard to get all of those people singing in harmony. But still, this is a little bit weird. I would have guessed early in the session they'll file a bill. They know that they need to fix it as they go along, but they'll file a bill just to get it out there and start the debate. That's not the path they chose.
Visiting with Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Ross, this week you guys rolled out some different polling numbers on a lot of different issues, and you have an analysis piece up today at texastribune.org that people can read. What if you can give us kind of a snapshot, I guess, of what you read into the different polling numbers that came out? What does it look like? What does Texas look like right now, and what are the main issues that the voters care about?
I think a couple of things. If you look at, I'm not starting here necessarily because it's the top item, but it's interesting. President Trump's reelect numbers are not as strong as they should be or you would expect them to be in a keystone Republican state like Texas. It's still a red state. I think when you name a Democrat, the numbers will change toward the president's line for. But right now, 49% of people in Texas would vote for Trump. 51% would vote for somebody else. In statistical terms, that's a virtual tie. And what it does is it tells both parties, you're going to have to play in Texas in a presidential year, maybe in a way you haven't had to for years. The Democrats and the Republicans alike have assumed Texas was going red. They come down here, get money, and go spend it in Iowa and New Hampshire. And those kinds of numbers tell you that they might be actually conducting a presidential race here in Texas, especially if, one of these Texans gets out of the Democratic pack on that side. So that was kind of interesting. If you go all the way to the less serious part of the spectrum, there's a pretty good contingent in Texas that wants to revive the UT Texas A&M football game. We polled right across the board, right? And then there are a bunch of issues in the middle that are sort of interesting. And what I thought was interesting was reading part of this poll when I sat down with the pollsters to kind of, field strip this thing and see what it looked like. There are a bunch of issues where you're looking at it and you're going, well, the governor's reading a poll that looks just like this because he said this the other day. And it looks like this is what this is the kind of result the speaker was looking at when he said this, or the lieutenant governor was looking at. And they're very much synced with voters on some things like property taxes, school finance, whether to limit cities and counties that raise their rates, all of those kinds of things. They seem to be pretty much in sync with voters. But on a number of other things, they seem to be out of sync with voters. And it's interesting because the rhetoric has been different from what we see in the numbers for the voter. An example of that is immigration, not immigration, vaccinations, paid sick leave, some issues like that. The voters are way over here, and the legislature's way over there. And the one that really grabbed me, because I thought it was interesting, was red flag laws.
Right.
These are the laws that say a court should be able to, if it deems someone a threat to him or herself or to others, to temporarily take away their guns. And it came up when the governor was conducting his roundtables after Santa Fe High School shooting. And it seemed to go to the back burner. It was one of the ideas that came up, seemed to go to the back burner. And frankly, it doesn't have a lot of rhetorical support in the Texas legislature right now. But a bunch of voters, like 7 out of 10 voters, want this thing, and it's popular with Democrats, Republicans, independents, all of the subgroups. So that's an area where the legislature might be looking at what the public's saying in polls like ours and polls that they do themselves and saying, well, maybe we need to change gears here.
Yeah. Let's see. Ross, before we let you go, tell folks kind of what they need to be looking forward to next week as far as the legislature goes. Anything big that you anticipate coming up?
Yeah, I think, these three issues that we've been talking about, but because they have been busy getting these bills filed this week and, getting their act together on that, next week they'll sort of go through the sorting hat, send these to committees, and we'll start seeing what the other issues of this session are going to be. And they're going to be some big ones. I think, for example, I mentioned paid sick leave a moment ago. There's a piece of legislation that would take away from cities these ordinances that require employers to pay their employees when they're sick. And that has already been amended to take away from cities control over, giving benefits to same-sex partners, for example. So already we're into social conservatism and maybe into some of the fights that animated the 2017 session. I don't know that that's going to be the one, but that's the kind of thing I'm looking for. What emerges behind school finance, property taxes, teacher pay raises, and the budget as a big issue for this legislative session?
Yeah, absolutely. Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. Tell folks what they can find on y'all's website.
Well, they'll find all these poll results. We just sent Jay Root, one of our reporters, down to Mexico for a couple of months to follow one of the families that's been going across Mexico, really a look at how the smuggling business works and how they smuggle people over the border. It's a really great series to look at. There's a documentary with it, and I would encourage people to take a little time and check that out over the weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune. That's texastribune.org. Ross, it's a pleasure having you on the show, and we'll visit with you again maybe later on during the session.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure, and have a good weekend.
You too. That's Ross Ramsey, executive editor of the Texas Tribune, hanging out with us in that segment, telling us what's happening down in Austin this week.